In 910, the weakened kingdom of East Francia faced another major Magyar invasion. After devastating raids and earlier victories against German forces, the Magyars threatened the kingdom's stability. Young King Louis the Child mobilized a large army and marched toward Augsburg, intending to confront them on the open plains of the Lechfeld. The Magyars, highly mobile mounted archers, were well suited to the terrain and could harass and outmaneuver the slower Frankish army. But the Frankish German forces were in a well-dug-in defensive position, which limited the Magyars' ability to maneuver. Despite East Francia's numerical strength and superior defensive position, the Magyars went on the offensive and launched a surprise attack, hoping to lure the enemy forces out of their defensive position. The attack caught many of the soldiers still asleep or scrambling to get ready for battle. Their mounted archers rode in and unleashed volley after volley of arrows, throwing the German ranks into confusion and causing losses before the army could properly form up. Instead of committing to a head-on fight, the Magyars kept moving. They would attack, pull back, and then strike again, using their speed and skilled archery to keep the Frankish soldiers constantly guessing. Arrows filled the air. Men struggled to get into formation. Frankish commanders hastily tried to organize a sally to confront the aggressors on the open field. The Magyars' greatest advantage at Lechfeld was mobility, not reckless charges. Their mounted archers could strike from multiple directions, withdraw before the enemy could respond, and then return to attack again from another angle. They frequently employed feigned retreats, deliberately luring Frankish troops into pursuit before suddenly turning and showering them with arrows. These tactics disrupted formations, created confusion, and prevented the Frankish forces from maintaining a cohesive battle line. Although the East Frankish and German soldiers were experienced warriors, they faced an enemy whose speed, mobility, mounted archery, and battlefield tactics were fundamentally different from the warfare they were accustomed to. The Magyars could choose when and where to engage, forcing the Frankish troops to react rather than dictate the course of the battle. At last, however, the Frankish-German forces managed to form a coherent defensive formation. With their ranks stabilized, their archers were able to provide sustained missile support, making it increasingly difficult for the Magyar horsemen to exploit gaps or approach with impunity. For a brief period, the two sides exchanged volleys of arrows. Projectiles filled the air as both armies absorbed losses, but the balance was beginning to shift. The Frankish formation was holding firm, denying the Magyars the easy targets and opportunities for disruption they had enjoyed earlier in the battle.
Stand like a man!
Although remaining on the defensive was a coherent strategy, the Magyar mounted archers were simply too fast and elusive for the Frankish archers to effectively counter. The Frankish commanders urged Louis to advance with his entire army and force the Magyars into a pitched battle. The young king took their advice. The Frankish-German army began to advance, but the soldiers were immediately subjected to a continuous barrage of arrows from the retreating Magyar horsemen. As the fighting dragged on, the Magyars began exploiting weaknesses within the Frankish army. The Germans struggled to maintain their formations. Whenever they advanced, the Magyar horsemen withdrew. But the moment the Franks slowed or stopped, the arrows began falling again. The battle became a test of patience and endurance. The Franks were constantly harassed, Yet they could not force the Magyars into the close combat, where their heavily armed troops held the greatest advantage. Groups of impatient Frankish infantry began breaking ranks and pursuing the Magyar riders, only to become isolated and vulnerable when the horsemen turned or continued their harassment from a safe distance. As the fighting spread across the battlefield, conditions became increasingly difficult for the German commanders. The Magyars moved rapidly around the Frankish formations, striking at vulnerable points and forcing the Germans to constantly turn, reform, and respond. Little by little, the Frankish army began to lose its cohesion. Even the Frankish cavalry struggled to give effective pursuit. The Magyar horsemen were simply too mobile, able to withdraw from danger before the heavier German troops could close the distance. What had begun as a determined advance intended to force a pitched battle was slowly turning into exactly the kind of mobile warfare the Magyars wanted. A battle in which they could dictate the distance, choose their targets, and strike whenever an opportunity presented itself. In their efforts to draw the Frankish army farther away from the safety of its camp, the Magyar riders began to grow overconfident. Some units lingered too long, allowing the charging German heavy cavalry to close the distance and cut down those who had failed to withdraw in time. But these losses did little to deter the Magyars. They continued to harass the Frankish army with relentless determination, seemingly intent on keeping the Germans moving and drawing them farther and farther from the security of their camp, regardless of the risks involved. By this stage of the battle, Louis and his Frankish-German army had committed themselves too deeply to the pursuit. They had already suffered considerable losses, and turning back now would mean abandoning the effort after paying a heavy price. Frustration and exhaustion began to take their toll. The longer the pursuit continued, the more difficult it became for the Frankish commanders to maintain a clear picture of the battlefield. Units became separated, formations stretched thin, and the army's attention remained fixed on the elusive Magyar horsemen ahead of them. The Magyars, meanwhile, continued to exploit the situation. Their mobility, discipline, and persistence allowed them to maintain pressure without becoming decisively engaged. Whenever the Frankish army slowed to regroup and restore its formations, the Magyar archers advanced once again, launching fresh attacks against the German lines. At first, this appeared almost foolish and suicidal. The greatest strength of the Frankish army lay in its heavily armed troops. If the Magyar horsemen became trapped in a prolonged close-quarters engagement, they could be overwhelmed by German infantry and cavalry. Yet the Magyars were not seeking a decisive melee. Their attacks were another calculated attempt to provoke the Franks into pursuit. By striking the German lines just as they were attempting to regroup, the Magyar riders encouraged Louis's soldiers to believe that the enemy was weakening and that a final victory was within reach. Once again, the Germans were being drawn forward. The Magyars were turning the Frankish army's desire for victory into a weapon against itself. The young East Frankish king, Louis, and his commanders believed they had finally driven the Magyars into a dead end. After hours of pursuit, the Germans thought victory was within reach. They committed to a full attack. The Magyar riders, who had spent much of the day evading the Germans, now appeared to have no choice but to turn and fight. But this was exactly what the Magyars wanted. As the Magyar horsemen suddenly charged from the front, additional riders emerged from the surrounding woodland, striking the Germans from unexpected directions. The Frankish army was exhausted. Its formations were stretched, its soldiers were far from camp, and it was now being attacked from multiple directions. The Germans had fallen into a trap. Once their formations lost cohesion, units became separated, and command and control began to break down. The organized army descended into a desperate struggle for survival. The Magyars immediately exploited the chaos. Their mounted warriors were perfectly suited for the pursuit. Infantrymen could not outrun horses, while wounded or isolated soldiers became easy targets for mounted archers. The horsemen could pursue fleeing groups, strike from a distance, and withdraw before the Germans could respond. The retreat quickly became a rout. What had begun as Louis's attempt to destroy the Magyar raiders had ended in a disastrous defeat. Despite the destruction of much of his army, Louis the Child survived and escaped toward Augsburg under escort. But the consequences were severe. Important nobles and commanders had been killed, the royal army had been shattered, and the Magyar threat remained unchecked. The Magyars continued their campaign, exploiting the collapse of Frankish resistance. Liutprand describes them advancing through Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, and Saxony, burning and plundering as they went. His account is highly rhetorical, so individual details should be treated cautiously. But the broader reality is clear. The East Frankish field army had been defeated, leaving much of the kingdom exposed to further Magyar raids. And the campaign was far from over.